My name is Rachel Ramenda, and I am so honored to welcome you to this panel. I would like to start by thanking our panelists, each of whom have made incredible contributions in the fight against human trafficking. We are fortunate to have such distinguished individuals who are eager to share their lives' work with us. Each panelist has years of experience and expertise on this issue, so I'm looking forward to hearing all of their insight on human trafficking. Some of you in the audience are very familiar with human trafficking, while others of you may be new to this issue. Human trafficking is a $150 billion industry that relies on the exploitation of more than 40 million people worldwide. Human trafficking is a term that refers to both sex trafficking and forced labor. Human traffickers use force, fraud, manipulation, and coercion to lure their victims into forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. While anyone can be made a victim of human trafficking, women and people of color are often targeted. Human trafficking occurs throughout the world, including in the United States. Now that I have provided you with some more background on human trafficking, I would like to turn the panel over to our guests. We have 6 human trafficking experts speaking with us tonight: Ambassador John Richmond, John Freeman, Nate Knapper, Chiquita Tillman, Jayne Bigelsen, and Jerome Elam. As a disclaimer, the views of the panelists do not necessarily represent the views of Stop Modern Day Slavery. All right, so now let's open the discussion with some introductions. I'd like to have each of you tell us a little bit about yourself, your career, your education, and how you got involved in doing the work you're doing today. So why don't we kick things off with Ambassador Richmond?
Thanks so much, Rachel, and so grateful for you hosting this and convening all of these people together. Kudos to you for all the work that went into making this happen. You know, for me, my journey into this field happened somewhat unintentionally. I've been really interested in issues of justice, this idea of learning how systems work and how we can make wrong things right, which is really what justice is. It's seeing something wrong and working to make it right. Went to law school, then I practiced law for a number of years. When I had an opportunity to shift to India and get a chance to live in another country, my wife and our daughter, we were all thrilled for a chance to go and start really figuring out how forced labor operates in India. First time I really got to sit down with victims and hear their stories and begin to learn how traffickers operate. I also got to sit down with many traffickers and hear their stories and learn how they think about the crime that they're committing. I worked there for an NGO called International Justice Mission, and we pioneered sort of the forced labor work in India. After 3 years, I shifted back to the United States. I worked as a federal prosecutor with the US Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division's criminal section, where I got to do all sorts of fascinating civil rights cases. My first trial was a cross-burning case to an all-white jury in Arkansas, and did police misconduct cases, but really focused on trafficking. And we founded the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit in 2007. And I prosecuted cases there for a decade. I then went and tried to do some broader work internationally with the Human Trafficking Institute until I was asked about serving as the US Ambassador for monitoring and combating trafficking in persons. You know, for most people, we think about ambassadors as someone who goes to another country and represents the United States on all sorts of issues. But the US has 6 ambassadors at large. So it's not an ambassador to a specific place, but an ambassador to everywhere on earth, and not on all issues, but just on one specific issue. And in the year 2000, I'm grateful that Congress elevated the issue of freedom, the issue of trafficking in persons, to the level of having an ambassador at large. And so in that role, I got to lead out on US foreign policy as it relates to trafficking in persons around the world, working with countries, working with multilateral organizations. But we also had a domestic mandate, which is a little unusual for the Department of State. We had a domestic mandate to coordinate the US interagency response domestically on trafficking in persons. And I so enjoyed learning more and more about how we can solve problems and function better as domestically as a federal government. And then our third mandate was to engage the field, to help new ideas form, to make sure more and more people have a seat at the table, to make sure that we can have a competition of ideas and let best practices come on board. So I'm so grateful for that. And we've seen a lot of that throughout the country. I'm glad to be with you tonight.
Thank you so much. Glad to have you here. All right, why don't we have John Freeman go next?
Thank you. Rachel, I really appreciate being invited to the panel. I'm honored to be on here with you and also talking to everyone who's on the webinar tonight. I'm a retired federal law enforcement agent. I spent 21 years with the United States Department of State. Sometimes would show up in meetings with Ambassador Richmond, which was a great honor because I got to know him when he was a prosecutor. Most of my last 10 years was focused on human trafficking cases, both with separate casework in a small office in Washington, D.C., but also helping my agency, the Diplomatic Security Service, connect and prosper in human trafficking investigations, really as augmenting on a task force or a working group. Because as State Department agents, we have agents all over the world in embassies and American consulates. So if there's information that we can help obtain to then funnel into, let's say, an American courtroom, so that Ambassador, then Prosecutor Richmond, could help to convict someone, that's something that we really wanted to achieve with a relatively small organization. I turned in the badge last summer because I saw the chance of a lifetime to go work in the anti-trafficking space in the nonprofit world for the Human Trafficking Institute. And following what Ambassador Richmond helped build, we're trying to help impart some of the best practices we've learned in a couple of international countries and seeing tremendous return on the human investment, sending experts in with best practices and in direct mentoring and training. Thanks again for having me on tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So glad you're here. All right, next, why don't we have Chiquita tell us a little bit about herself?
Thank you, Rachel, so much for having me. I appreciate it. This wonderful, amazing panel tonight. I'm just so excited. I am actually a survivor of sex trafficking, and my mission has been to just help survivors and victims to overcome that traumatic past and to, let them know that they can have a productive life. They can be healed from it. There's a whole life after that. But I do understand the trauma that goes along with that lifestyle. Just encouraging them to, get the counseling that they need and to have like a loving support system. And that's just my mission, is just to help them get past that.
That's amazing. Thank you. All right, Nate, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Absolutely. So pleased to be a part of this panel tonight. And Rachel, thank you so much for the invitation to join and to stop modern day slavery. I appreciate the sponsorship of the event. And to my fellow panelists, thank you as well for taking the time out of your schedules to join this conversation, this very important conversation tonight. You could think of me maybe as a cross between the other two Johns that we have on the panel. So I have legal training in my background. I started my career as an attorney, working at the state of Michigan Attorney General's office, where I prosecuted cases as well. But I transitioned away from that role about 5 years ago now to join the Detroit division of the FBI as a current special agent. And so both in my attorney and in my agent capacity, I have had the opportunity to work with human trafficking survivors firsthand, to hear their stories, to hear about their struggles. And it's been a very meaningful experience for me all along the way. And one of the great things that my eyes were open to along the way is that survivors tend to have very deep legal needs when they come out of their circumstances of exploitation. And so as my eyes were continually open to that through the years in the course of my work, I made the decision to found a nonprofit organization of my own, Detroit-based, but quickly growing into other states around the country as well. It's called the Joseph Project. And this is an organization that strives to connect survivors of trafficking with pro bono legal counsel. So that's an important part of my anti-trafficking mission, and something that I hope we can talk a little bit more about tonight. So again, Rachel, thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Jayne, how about we have you go next?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. I feel just honored being in the company of this panel, and thank you all for everyone who's attending. I work at Covenant House, New York, where we work with young adults between the ages of 16 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness. We're located right in Midtown Manhattan, although we're part of a national, actually international federation of shelters. And we start with the basics that most of us take for granted: food, shelter, a shower, laundry, but we offer so much more: legal help, an on-site medical clinic, substance abuse help, huge mental health team, job training and education. And we have a program for single female identified clients, single male identified clients, as well as mothers and their babies. So we're not a specific anti-trafficking agency. Why do we care about this issue? Sadly, because the pimps and the traffickers target our young people. In fact, I just got off a conversation about the fact that they're literally just in the past couple of weeks, there's a car parked outside of our building trying to recruit every female identified client that walks by. So the pimps target our young people. And recent research shows that up to 20 to 25% of our young people have experiences that fit the federal definition of trafficking. So that's why it's an issue that's very close to Covenant House's heart. In the last 8 years, I've been helping Covenant House build their anti-trafficking programming. We just opened a safe house yesterday in the Bronx for 5 female identified survivors of trafficking. Sadly, 5 is a really small number considering we have hundreds of survivors, but we also have programming on our main 41st Street shelter as well. Thank you.
That's amazing. Congratulations. Last but certainly not least, when we have Jerome, please introduce yourself.
Oh, Rachel, thank you so much. Such an honor to be amongst these amazing and courageous panelists here tonight. And it's an honor to be here. You know, my name is Jerome Elam. I am a survivor of child sex trafficking from the age of 5 to the age of 12. I was trafficked by my mother's boyfriend. And my mother was an alcoholic, pregnant at 17, and this predator targeted me through her, and he kept my silence by threatening her life. And I was sold for a total of 10 years, and I tried to tell, you know, so many people that I was being trafficked, and no one listened. And the people included an ER doctor and a teacher. And finally, at the age of 12, you know, I was filled with such despair that my life was meaningless. You know, I took a bottle of sleeping pills and a bottle of vodka, went to my mother's rose garden, laid down, took the vodka, the sleeping pills, you know, drifted off to sleep. But at that point, I heard a voice that spoke to me, and it said, you know, your time on earth isn't done. I want you to go back and fight for every child. And so from that day forward, I had the strength to fight back against the darkness. And I finally got noticed, and it was a nurse in that emergency room who finally noticed that I was suffering from, you know, from intense trauma, from being victimized. And that's why I honor nurses as often as I can, because they're such important people in the front line of this. And so at the age of 17, I joined the United States Marine Corps to get out of the area I was in and kind of put this all behind me. But then when Jerry Sandusky was arrested for molesting young boys, a voice inside me said, you've got to speak out. So I wrote an article that was published by the Washington Times, and I began to get such a response from people all over the world that encouraged me to share my voice. And that began my journey to where I am today. And I'm so incredibly honored that I was just recently appointed to the inaugural advisory council for the Organization for Security and Economic Cooperation in Europe's Organization for Democratic Initiatives and Human Rights. And I have been working in Ukraine, Uzbekistan, India, Africa, and Pakistan, all over the world. And there's one thing that's very true, no matter where you are. You know, we all care and love our children with every ounce of our heart. And so tonight we gather here to fight and push back against the darkness and from a firewall to stop the next person from suffering as I have.
Thank you, Jerome. All right, so as you can tell, we have an incredible lineup. These are 6 people that I really look up to, and I am so excited to hear what they have to say. So why don't we jump right into the questions? My first question is for Ambassador Richmond. I would like to talk about national security and human trafficking. Could you tell us what is the intersection between national security and human trafficking? And what kinds of national security efforts could be undertaken by the federal government to stop human trafficking and protect survivors? I think you're muted.
Rachel, I really appreciate that question because there are national security implications to human trafficking. We have state-sanctioned forced labor in some parts of the world. We have non-state armed groups like ISIS, West Africa, Boko Haram, who are forcing people to labor, forcing people into sex slavery. We also have children in armed conflict as a form of human trafficking. And there are so many different ways that we see expressions of trafficking that come alongside and cause us to be concerned about our own national security. But I think it's worth pausing for a moment and making sure we're clarifying the difference between smuggling and trafficking, because so often people think about trafficking as a crime of movement. It's a crime about moving someone from one place to another. And so we conflate ideas that are important about immigration with ideas that are important about trafficking. So human smuggling is a crime of movement. It's about moving someone across a border. It can happen voluntarily or involuntarily. Some people want to be smuggled across a border. It's crime against the integrity of a nation's laws. But trafficking is quite different. Trafficking is always about coercion. Trafficking is always involuntary. And it's not about a crime against a country's laws. It's a crime against someone's fundamental human rights. It's an assault on their human dignity. This idea that they have inherent value, not value that comes from government, but value that precedes government, that they have the right to life and liberty. And so when a trafficker engages in those crimes, they do something quite different. And so I think often we can think about immigration and border security as national security issues, and people can rightly have debates about different policies. I think we can have an effective immigration regime and an effective counter-trafficking regime. But we do want to be careful that just because they overlap at times, that is, sometimes a trafficking case does involve moving people across borders. I think we also want to recognize that the United Nations estimated that 71% of trafficking victims are trafficked in their country of origin. They never moved anywhere. So that can be labor trafficking cases or sex trafficking cases. It can be adults or children, boys, girls, women, men. It can be in any sector that the trafficker chooses, because the trafficker is the one who's driving this crime. They're the ones who are deciding which acts they're going to commit, what coercive scheme they're going to employ, and what industry they're going to try to profit from someone else's body or someone else's labor. And so as we think about national security, I think we just need to recognize that public justice systems are essential to national security. We know that where we have effective rule of law in a country and effective public justice systems, we then can have effective social service delivery systems and protection and care for survivors. But where governments are unable to maintain rule of law, it's going to cause a national security concern for the United States.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Jerome, why don't I throw this question over to you? Do you have a response to Ambassador Richmond?
I agree totally with Ambassador Richmond. I think also, you talk about organized crime and how that proliferates with human trafficking. I mean, we've seen just predominantly, the gangs that used to sell drugs have now turned to human trafficking because you only sell a drug once. You can sell a human, 12 to 15 times a day. So it really is a threat to our national security, because when organized crime comes in and begins trafficking, people in this country, as well as people they bring into this country, it really does eat away, at the fabric of our society. So we have to really be, educated and aware of what's going on in terms of what to look for in victims. And as John said, we look at labor trafficking, which is real prolific in this country, but we've actually seen intersections where, victims are both labor and sex trafficked as well. So they can be exploited, for every ounce of their humanity. So it's really critical for us all to be educated and aware, not only, for the sake of our humanity, but also just for the sake of protecting the country, making sure that we keep things safe for everybody. Because, as long as organized crime can come in and begin to sell human beings, it's only going to get worse because it's too lucrative. I mean, it's billions of dollars a year that they're actually making off people. And again, and it's gotten, unfortunately, we're trying to keep up because, we've seen a rise in the use of cryptocurrency in human trafficking. And that's also a threat to our national security where human traffickers and smugglers are using cryptocurrency to actually exchange for human beings and other services. So we have to really be vigilant and educate ourselves and make sure that we protect everybody who actually is illegally brought into this country, but also those that are taken from this country and trafficked as well.
Thank you so much. All right, now I'd like to move to our second question. This one is for Nate. My question for you is about border policies and immigration. So continuing on a similar theme of what we just discussed. So as I'm sure we're all aware, President Trump and President Biden have taken extremely different approaches to ICE policies, how many people to let into the country, and more. Could you talk to us about how those border policies affect human trafficking and your line of work specifically?
Sure, happy to do that. So, let me just begin by saying that I would agree with the fundamental premise of the question, which is that border policy does indeed impact human trafficking. I would further agree with the idea that Presidents Trump and Biden have taken very different approaches to the issue of our border. I want to be very intentional about not opining about the correctness of this policy or that, given the federal nature of my position. So I'll refrain from suggesting which policy is more effective than another. But I am more than happy to talk about how the things that happen at the border would, for example, impact our work. So I guess leading off from a law enforcement perspective, as a federal agent of the FBI, especially if you were at the southern border, of course, in Michigan, here in the Detroit area, we of course share the border with Canada as well. So we could think of it in those terms as well. When you have a person who is moved across an international border, Ambassador Richmond, very correct in saying that you don't necessarily have a case of human trafficking yet. What you would need to identify is whether the person who was moved has been commercially exploited for sex or labor services through force, fraud, or coercion. If you can identify that violation, then you have invoked the federal human trafficking laws. And so from a law enforcement standpoint, it would involve opening a case, taking a look at the circumstances, collecting evidence, of course, and making a determination about whether that case can be prosecuted in a court of law. And you would do that in conjunction with an assistant United States attorney, most commonly, or somebody from the state attorney general's office, perhaps in some cases. And the case would proceed from there. The legal process would play out. But as you are prosecuting the perpetrator in that particular scenario, what I am also very careful to point out and remember is that you also have a survivor in that equation as well. And I don't want that person to be forgotten about. And so with respect to the Joseph Project, one of the things that we would try to do with the survivor in that scenario is we would seek very aggressively to match them with what we would call a legal first responder. This is a pro bono attorney who would be willing to step up and meet the urgent legal needs of that survivor free of charge. It may be lost on some people that that person who was moved across the border and is technically in the country illegally has certain opportunities under the structure of our laws to stay in the country legally, to work in a legal capacity and to start to rebuild their life here domestically in a very productive way. You could talk about things like a T visa or a U visa. There are continued presence concepts that the Department of Homeland Security has. They all have their own idiosyncrasies, but the basic notion of them is the same, that they would allow a survivor to take advantage of our laws to stay and to work and to rebuild. But the key that I want to point out is that very oftentimes without legal counsel, it's very difficult to take advantage of those legal mechanisms. And so, I'm very passionate about seeing those survivors connected with the pro bono legal counsel that can help them take advantage of the things that would help them in a scenario like that. And the reason I say pro bono and stress that so strongly is because survivors very oftentimes, they don't understand the legal issues that they have, and they don't have the financial means to address them. And so it's got to be free. And we have the lawyers who are willing to step up and meet those needs free of charge. They will do it. They will raise their hands. And it means a great deal to them when they win, as it does for the survivor.
Thank you. That's very interesting. All right, John Freeman, I'll throw the same question out to you. Do you agree with Nate? Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh yeah, tremendously agree with him. I think most people would be astonished that as administrations change, for most of us doing day-to-day government work, our work doesn't change very much. I think some of the most impactful changes I ever saw was maybe if there was a surge at the border, like there was recently, like there was 3 to 5 years ago, and maybe 7 years before that, that if I was working on a combined team of representatives from my agency, the FBI, Homeland Security, the local police department, the state troopers, local prosecutors, NGOs to provide assistance to victims, if something big happened, it might cause some of our team members to be pulled away and go back to a more traditional role that they have. So if there was a surge at the border, maybe some of my partner ICE agents would be pulled off of a team effort to go down and help with work along the border. But for the most part, the administration changes really don't impact us that much. As you've heard a little bit tonight, ultimately what we hope to find is evidence to prove that the crimes have been committed, or move on to the next case. So to understand the trauma that a victim may have gone through, to fully understand the grasp of the depth of that trauma, to then have that applied to charges where we know crimes have been committed, helps us to then get our cases in front of a prosecutor. We would like to move as efficiently as possible, going from initiating a case to closing a case, because there's always going to be a new case coming up on the heels of the one we just started. So as we can become more efficient to get a case processed, to get that trafficker off the street, potentially in jail, ideally with some restitution going back towards the survivor or survivors, that's a tremendous goal. When we have less than efficient episodes, it impacts all of us across a team. And if you don't really have a team effort, an impact based upon maybe a lack of funds that could come in to help a team, or if you had someone, I don't know, retire, or if someone moved on to a new assignment, that's a change in the efficiency of your team. So it's more of a organizational change, I would say, than it would be like based upon the administrative changes, solely around the White House.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for those answers. My next question is for Chiquita. My question for you is about human trafficking in relation to COVID-19. So as I'm sure we all know on this panel, human trafficking has really surged since the pandemic began. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, crisis cases nationwide, increased by more than 40% since April 2020. How has COVID affected your ability to help survivors and work with survivors and do the work that you do?
the overall ability to provide direct services, definitely. Donations have declined. Just being able to put together fundraisers to help bring in money to assist, survivors and victims. It's been hard having limited access to resources that can help identify and provide assistance to survivors and victims. It's been really difficult because, of course, with the stay-at-home issue, the social distancing, traffickers are going more underground. They're targeting the children that are home from school, so they're online more, luring children. So it's been really, really difficult having that direct contact with survivors and victims. For me personally, I love to mentor. So not being able to be there and help them is been really, really tough.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate.
It is.
Ambassador Richmond, I'd like to give this question to you as well. In your line of work and with your colleagues, what has the reaction to COVID-19 been?
I just want to echo what Chiquita said about the deep impact it's had on survivors who are seeking services, and a lot of those services aren't available. When we think about government shutdown orders requiring some victims to quarantine with their traffickers, when we realize that so many cases in the United States are family-directed trafficking, that is, where the relationship between the victim and the trafficker is familial. And so a lot of people have been at additional risk because of the response to the virus. One thing we have noticed, though, is that traffickers have not shut down at all. They're continuing to adapt to this situation and continue to find ways to make their money. We've seen a rise in online sex trafficking, an explosion in child sexual abuse material online. We've seen traffickers released pre-trial from jail, and survivors worried if their trafficker is still around. Will there be continued harassment? Will they try to trap them in exploitation again? And it's not just in the United States. That's true in other countries around the world. In many places, courts themselves have shuttered and cases are not being processed, which means that traffickers continue to not be held accountable. And services get diverted by governments. They divert from providing resources to survivors, to care, to proactive plans to make sure we're tailoring our care plans to the individual and not shoehorning survivors into pre-scripted grant programs that weren't the ideal program for them. All these resources get diverted towards a public health crisis. And folks will look back in history and decide, are those good management decisions, those wise calls? It's hard for us in the middle of a global health crisis to know, are we making the right judgment calls or not? But I can tell you that it's had an adverse impact on people who need care and people who need protection services. And traffickers are continuing to rake in the money. So as we come out of this, as we emerge from COVID-19, I think we need to be incredibly intentional about investing in caring for survivors and providing long-term care plans that include housing and all the things that Jayne was talking about earlier, economic opportunities to make sure that they can move forward. And we're going to have to make sure that we're holding traffickers accountable as well. That it's going to require a huge investment, I think, in all 3 Ps of the 3P paradigm. And Rachel, you put this out in the awareness materials for this event. That's prosecution, protection, and prevention. And they are 3 legs of a stool. All 3 are necessary. One is not more important than the other. They're mutually reinforcing and supportive. And I think it's going to require an investment as we emerge from COVID-19.
Absolutely. It's so unfortunate to see human trafficking surge and, survivors aren't getting the help they need. So thank you both for those answers. That was very insightful. All right, next, I have a question for John Freeman. My question to you is about undocumented immigrants. So many times when undocumented immigrants are trafficked, they are afraid to get help because they fear they might be deported. What should be done about this? And what kind of campaign might be able to reach them and let them know that there are options for them available in this country and that they will not be forced to leave?
So that fear that a trafficker will place into a victim is a very real and controlling emotion. And it's one, I think sometimes it's based upon what maybe the person might have experienced in their home country. What is law enforcement or military or security elements like where they're from. And if the trafficker is aware that they come from a place where maybe things are very heavy-handed or not always done with an eye towards human rights, that level of exploitation, that level of coercion can be near crippling. And so just the simple whisper of, if you cross a line with me, I'm calling immigration, or I'm going to have you deported, or even worse. We've interviewed victims who thought they would be killed if they were to cross the trafficker. Hopefully, as someone may find themselves in a situation with some way to either make a connection by communications, get a phone call out, a message, call the hotline. We've encountered victims who've been approached by people in a grocery store. Hey, you look like you might be from where I'm from too, but I've never seen you before. Or maybe in a place of worship. How come you've never come here before? And as they start to open up and tell a little bit more about their story, sometimes they're comfortable enough and take the courageous step and saying, I think I might be in trouble. And it's human nature for the others, hopefully, to then offer them some type of lifeline. We would hope that as more and more people learn about the national hotline, to get people to call into that. Sometimes is reaching out to a member of the community, a member of the clergy, healthcare providers. Jerome alluded to it earlier. We want to get information out to teachers. We want all of society to understand it. Department of Homeland Security's effort facing the American public is called the Blue Campaign. They have a website, there's training elements built within it, there's connections. The more that we empower all Americans to be on the lookout for trafficking, the greater chance that we'll have of seeing someone who just doesn't seem like they're in the right place, or maybe if they need help. For most of us, that's in our human nature. You look like you might need help. Can I help you with something? On a more kind of programmatic level, and sorry to keep going back to my former employer, as American laws were changing all the way back to the year 2000, when the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act was first started. That's a federal law that gets looked at about every 3 years or so. In 2008, there was a revision to that law that effectively told us in the State Department, you've got to better inform people who are applying for visas to come work in the United States. And that ultimately produced what's called the Wilberforce Pamphlet. It's named after William Wilberforce, a British abolitionist from centuries ago. And all of us in the State Department know about the Wilberforce pamphlet. It's 15 pages of information. It's written in many, many languages. So if you were to apply for a visa to come into the United States, which is going to start happening again as the pandemic recedes, and you think you're going to be coming to work in the United States, you receive this pamphlet. I don't remember the stats from a few years ago, but a number of people who said that the impetus for them to call the hotline after they realized they were in a trafficking situation was because they had the Wilberforce pamphlet from the time they got the visa all the way until their travel through and into the United States. There's lots of grassroots efforts, devices like a smartphone, Twitter, Facebook, all the other social media platforms. The more that we can put information out there. If you see something, say something. If you think you're in trouble, reach out for help. it's becoming more and more available globally in every corner of the world. Those are things that require funding. And so we've got to keep going back to Congress or whomever to say, would you please keep funding this? But the word is going to get out there, but we have plenty of work left to do.
Agreed. I definitely agree with all that you just said. Yeah, I think that message of if you see something, say something is so important. So I hope everyone in the audience keeps that in mind. All right, Chiquita, I'd like to ask you the same question. Would you agree with what's been said? Is there anything else you would like to add?
Definitely agree. And, I know all too well the fear of wanting to speak out and just not knowing what the consequence will be. I believe if they're educated on the laws, the current laws that are in place that can protect them, as well as knowing their rights, I believe it would eliminate some of the fear of them speaking out and feeling like they'll be deported. So I believe if we could do like a campaign where we can go and do outreach in the vulnerable communities to help them to understand their rights and the laws, I think that would help a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree. All right, my next question is for Jerome. So sometimes individuals who escape human trafficking suddenly find themselves without shelter and return to their trafficker for a place to stay. How can professionals in the anti-human trafficking space break the cycle of trafficking victims returning back to their trafficker?
Gosh, Richard, what a great question. I mean, this is something that we struggle with. Those of us who work in this field constantly. Trauma-informed care. I mean, offering services that help a victim recover, looking at what we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, look at what's driving that vulnerability in victims to help them overcome that, because it's unconscionable to think, even in my case, I can vouch for this, that in a lot of cases, the trafficker is telling you things and offering you things that you're not getting from your own family. I mean, what I say for my own case is that I was a child desperate for affection, like a drowning man's desperate for oxygen. I mean, I wanted someone to care about me, if only for a second. And this trafficker came along and he was like buying me gifts, doing all these things to make me feel like, I was special. And then, the thing about grooming, which is how they psychologically blackmail you, is they not only groom the child, they groom all the adults around the child. So you're in this unescapable trap. So we've got to look at, what's causing this vulnerability, because for a lot of victims who end up back in the life, I mean, they feel like they don't deserve better. We have to elevate them, lift them up, make them feel like they matter, give them high school equivalency, give them job skills, help them rise up and have a sense of pride. And that way you can really curb that recidivism back to the street. Because if we don't do that, it's only going to be a revolving door. We have to offer services, especially for our LGBTQ victims, our survivors of color. We have to really take into consideration, what their needs are specifically. We can't lump everybody into a general category, but we have to become more aware of what the needs of survivors is, because that trauma is so unique that we have to make sure that if we have that one chance to help them, that we don't waste that we actually go in with all the resources we have and help them reclaim their lives and realize they do matter and they are worthy of love and they always will be.
Absolutely. Jayne, I see you nodding along. Why don't you chime in?
Yeah, just 100% to everything that Jerome just said. I mean, I just want to say, like, ditto to that. The hardest part for me doing this work and for the team that I work with is the fact that our young people often go back to the life and to their trafficker. It's similar to domestic violence. It can take 4, 5 times. I don't know how familiar the audience is about human trafficking, but I think that television makes it look like that some random person is kidnapped off the street and locked up in a cage, and then law enforcement busts in, takes them out, and it's all over. I suppose that can happen. I've been working at Covenant House for 10 years. I've never seen it, right? Instead, it's exactly what Jerome says. The pimps and the traffickers are looking for people who are vulnerable, right? They're looking for people. So that trauma bond is so real. I've had one young person tell me that her pimp was the first person to ever give her a birthday cake, right? And an adult survivor tell me that her pimp was the first person to ever give her a hug. So there's two, there's the concrete needs, right? If you don't have a house, you don't have a job, you don't have, right? What else are you going to do but go back to the life of prostitution? But you're also traumatically bonded to the trafficker, right? It's much more similar, at least in my experience, many times, to domestic violence, where these traffickers alternate between perceived love and affection and hate and threats. So a lot of my young people don't think that they're trafficking victims, right? And it's not my job to tell them that they are, but they actually think that they love their trafficker. So they'll come to us in a time like after they've been beaten up, or they just can't take it anymore. And they'll come back to us at Covenant House, and we have a short period of time before they're going to go back to the pimp again. And in that time, it's our job to meet them where they're at and get them whatever their needs may be. And I was just speaking to a survivor last week, and someone asked her what was the most important thing that Covenant House gave her. And I thought she was going to say housing, or we actually helped her get a job and an internship with a stipend. So I was expecting her to say that. She was like, no, they were the first person who just listened to me and didn't seem disgusted with who I was and let me know that I did nothing wrong. So it's really just listening and non-judgmental support. But yes, also you need the job training and the education and all of those things. And I mean, I know in the beginning of this job, I went to my boss at one time when one of our clients who was doing super well had just gotten a high school equivalency diploma, and we were all so proud of her. And she not only went back to the pimp, but she tried to take 4 other young women with her. And I was devastated. I wanted to quit. And I just remember my boss saying, I remember her saying, like, I think this entire program is a failure. And she's like, no, you have to redefine failure. For 6 months, this young person had a safe place to stay where she wasn't beaten up. And we gave her those services. And when she gets tired of this pimp again, she knows that there are adults who care, who will be there for her. So it's all of the above.
Absolutely. I always say traffickers are master manipulators. They unfortunately are smart. They know what they're doing, which is just such a waste. It's so unfortunate. Ambassador Richmond, would you like to add something?
If I could, I agree with everything that's just been said about this, and making sure we get great services for survivors to protect them. But I just want to note the idea that why in the world are the traffickers available for the victims to go back to? This is a deep concern, because you are far more likely, I think, to get arrested as a trafficking victim in America than as a trafficker. And we need to make sure that we keep all the focus on both caring for the victims and making sure we have a victim-centered approach. But we have to make sure that all the responsibility for the actual trafficking offense is on the trafficker. And we ought to be tangling them up with charges to make sure that there are no pimps and traffickers for these victims to go back to. We need to make sure that we're honoring our obligations not to prosecute victims, and make sure that we're honoring our obligations to hold the traffickers accountable.
Absolutely. It's so wrong that trafficking victims are the ones who think they're going to be arrested. They're the ones who did something wrong, and the trafficker just gets to go free. So I think all 3 of you raised really excellent points. All right, Jayne, I have another question for you. I'd like to talk about another big topic in this community, which is the decriminalization of prostitution. This is probably one of the most talked about issues when it comes to human trafficking. So there are several different models for the decriminalization or partial decriminalization of sex work. Could you tell me about the pros and cons of these different models, and what your take on each of those models is?
Yes, this is a complicated question and pretty tricky to do in 5 minutes. In fact, we just had a panel a few weeks ago that was a full hour and a half just on this topic, but I'll do my best. And then I'll give what my opinions and Covenant House opinion is. So right now, the current model we have in most of the US is full decriminalization, right? Where both those selling sex and those buying and promoting sex, it's all illegal, right? There's a movement going on across this country to fully decriminalize both the buying and the selling of sex. And it's happening in cities across the United States. And then there's partial decriminalization. And that's the model that I believe in and that Covenant House believes in. In that model, the person selling sex would never be arrested or prosecuted. But the buyers, the sex buyers and the promoters and pimps would still be held accountable. I think there's not that much controversy anymore about those selling sex. There's no reason to be arresting and prosecuting someone selling sex. They're either a victim of human trafficking or a vulnerable person, and they're not hurting anyone. They need social services, not handcuffs. And I think there's not as much debate there. Some of the debate is happening on whether people want full decriminalization, which would also let the sex buyers and the pimps and the promoters off and not be held accountable. And I know we have college students in the audience, and I know that there's this great movement to fully decriminalize, and people are saying sex work is work, and it's not my job to change anyone's minds. But I do ask that people think just a little more carefully, because it's much more complicated and much more nuanced than a slogan of sex work is work. And there are some dangerous things that could happen if it was fully decriminalized. So a few things, I mentioned before that a lot of my young people, don't even know that they're victims. And I think people who are advocating for full decriminalization believe that you can draw this bright line between what's consensual, right, and what's not, which is what's trafficking. But what I found in my office, I can't tell you how many young people come to my office and tell me, Miss Jayne, this is what I want to do. It's my choice. And it's not my job to tell them that that's not true. But that same young person will come to me a year later and be like, I really didn't have a choice, right? Like my father or my brother or my boyfriend was making me do it. So that line between what's consent and what's non-consensual is not very clear. I've also noticed doing this work, I used to run the program in conjunction with a psychiatrist, that the psychological issues were the same, whether or not the young person identified as a consensual sex worker or someone who had been trafficked, right? The PTSD, the low self-esteem, what else am I gonna do? The anxiety was the same in both groups. And there's also, and the studies show that 95% of people in the sex trade have previous sexual abuse. So if sex work is work like any other work, I ask, like, what other work is prior sex abuse a prerequisite and PTSD and anxiety a consequence, right? Both groups of young people told me that they needed to dissociate to get through the day, whether it was substances or psychologically dissociating. So what other work is that a requirement? And then in the beginning, I mentioned that we've got 2 cars of people trying to recruit our young people outside of Covenant House, right? If prostitution was fully decriminalized, we would not be able to call the police and do anything about it. It would be perfectly legal, right? So the pimps and traffickers are not in front of Columbia University recruiting. They're in front of places like Covenant House. They're in front of child welfare organizations, right? And it would be perfectly legal for them to recruit anyone over 18. And the young people I work with are 18, 19, and 20. It would be perfectly legal to recruit them. In fact, we had, and Rachel, cut me off if I'm going too long because I've got 2 quick points. About 5 or 6 years ago, we had a pimp put an ad in Craigslist. This is how brazen they are, being like, if you work at the Cove, if you live at the Cove, we can help you find a nicer place to stay. And it had $ and alcohol bottles. We were able to consult our law enforcement partners who did an investigation and found a trafficking ring, and that pimp's in jail for a very long time. If prostitution was fully decriminalized, we would not have been able to get law enforcement's help with that. So I just think there's some dangers in the full decriminalization idea. And many people are saying it's progressive, but what I'm seeing is that it's mostly poor women, either cisgender or transgender women of color, being bought by mostly rich men. So I don't quite see the progressiveness in that. And I guess lastly, why does human trafficking exist? Because there are people willing to pay money to purchase sex, right? So if you fully legalize it, that adds more people who are willing to purchase sex and will add more money into the system. So that's more money for pimps and traffickers to make. There's not enough people out there who are willing to consensually sell sex. There are some, but there's not enough. So with all that extra money to be made, that's more of a reason for pimps and traffickers to lure in vulnerable young people like those at Covenant House. And then my last point too is there's the inherent violent nature of commercial sex. If you read the studies, once you've purchased another human being, you start to treat them like a commodity. And when something is a commodity, you feel like it's easier to be violent to them. And all of the research backs that up. So that is why Covenant House supports, and I support that partial decriminalization. Let's stop arresting and prosecuting anybody selling sex, but I don't see why we'd want to give the buyers, the promoters, and the pimps a free pass.
Thank you. That was very insightful. It's definitely such a complex topic, and you're right. 5 minutes is definitely not enough time. I'm not even sure if an hour is enough time. So thank you for that response. John Freeman, could I get your thoughts on this issue?
Sure. Again, really simplistically, from a law enforcement point of view, whatever the laws are as they pertain to that city, state, nation, those of us who are charged with enforcing those laws, those will be the laws that we enforce. As there's movement afoot to try to change some of the laws, that would then change the approach with which law enforcement did or did not conduct investigations related to victims of commercial sex trafficking. The cases that I specifically worked on, my early introduction to commercial sex trafficking was in 2005 as part of a multi-agency, multi-effort jurisdictional task force across the Bay Area in San Francisco. And on one day, we went to 10 covert brothels, about 150 law enforcement, about 15 people per site, in with warrants, search warrants, arrest warrants, to go after the traffickers. Went in, and not only did we encounter the managers of the brothels, the workers inside the brothel, the Johns. And I'm just going to say, for the sake of a quick point, my first name is not the best first name to have in this industry. I should have used my middle name, because earlier when Nate said the Johns, I was not thinking about the ambassador and myself. Sorry. It's a serious topic, but of the people that we encountered, none of those women on that day were willing sex workers who thought it was their employment. All of them were Koreans who had come to the United States, some who had entered illegally, some who had entered as students but were not students. None of them were arrested that day. 150 sex workers, as we would describe them, none of them were arrested. They were all asked if they would help to identify who the ringleaders were, who was threatening them. Most of them said, I just want to go home. And our government facilitated that. They went home. Now, if you fast forward 3 years, I was assigned to the American Embassy in Seoul, Korea, and I was able to help be part of a connection made between the American government and the South Korean government to better identify elements of commercial trafficking tied to organized crime. I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars, not $100 at a pop, out on the track or on a street corner. No. Hundreds of millions of dollars. It was not operational at the time that I was leaving Korea, but by about 2013, 2014, at one point there were simultaneous raids to take down the organized crime elements. As long as the criminals will organize to then exploit and make more money, I think you want people like Nate and others in law enforcement to be addressing the crimes and to identify the criminals who are exploiting people. Like Jayne said, it's very hard to argue if someone identifies that that is their line of work. If the laws change, I think that would be something that would put them on a more firm ground. But I don't know that the laws are going to change that rapidly.
Great. Thank you for that, both of you. You know, I think this is just such a complex issue that I wanted to open it up to the other panelists. Do any of you have thoughts that you wanted to share on the issue of decriminalization?
You know, I throw out one observation that I've been paying attention to as this debate rages. And I'll also just be honest, I think this is going to divide the anti-trafficking community over the next year or two. And I'm sort of preemptively grieving that because I think there's so many good people in this movement. But one thing I've noticed that I wonder if others have as well is that where the decrim efforts have not been successful thus far in state legislatures, there have been some successes for the decrim movement with individual district attorneys, whether it's Los Angeles, Baltimore, Ann Arbor. I think there may be some others where district attorneys have exercised their prosecutorial discretion to say, we're not going to arrest anyone that is selling, buying, or organizing around commercial sex. And I wonder if that's going to be a trend. I wonder if that's going to be a way to expand what's happening around the efforts around decrim, and whether that would have adverse reactions to folks who want to push the equality or the Nordic or the partial decrim model.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Did anyone else want to weigh in on this, or I will move on? All right. The next question I have is for Ambassador Richmond. So as I discussed in my opening, human trafficking is not just sex trafficking. I think that is a pretty common misconception that I've run into, and I'm sure many of you have too. There's also this aspect of forced labor, which is huge worldwide, but it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So I wanted to hear from you. What have you seen in this space? What have you been able to do in this space? And what do you think the government stance should be on forced labor?
Yeah, well, I think the U.S. government's stance is pretty clear, is that we want to make sure that we're emphasizing forced labor, that there are two types of trafficking primarily in the U.S., and that's sex trafficking as well as forced labor. We talk about it a great deal. We train on it a great deal. The challenge is our execution. We do an abysmal job at identifying and handling forced labor cases. In fact, it's been so frustrating to so many for so many years that in the U.S. narrative of the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, it lists a series of recommendations for the U.S., just like it does for every other country that is evaluated, 188 countries around the world. The number one recommendation for the United States for the last 5 years, and if I could predict, knowing some of our friends at the State Department, it will be the number one recommendation again this year, is to increase our labor trafficking cases. And yet the numbers have not increased. They just continue to trickle along. And there's some incredible labor trafficking cases that have been handled right here in the United States. Compelling facts. We just had an amazing order from the Fourth Circuit a week or so ago in a labor trafficking case from South Carolina. An adult man with some intellectual disabilities was forced to work in a restaurant called JJ's Cafeteria for at least 7 or 8 years. Fourth Circuit ordered that they had to double his restitution award. I could not be happier. And the hardworking folks that worked that case deserve a huge thank you. And the folks providing services deserve some encouragement. So there are good labor trafficking cases to be done. Our challenge is that we're not identifying them. And so I think there's a couple reasons. One, the underlying activity is not criminalized. So unlike the selling or buying of commercial sex, that is a crime, it's much easier for us to identify those cases because the underlying activity has been criminalized. It's not against the law to clean a big box store. And so police could drive right by a strip mall and see someone cleaning a store at night, and It's not jarring. It's not emotionally evocative. And that's different when you see a young person, a young boy being sold for sex, or a young girl being sold for sex. Something feels out of place. Something feels wrong about that. If someone's forced to clean rooms in a hotel, it's not going to cause anyone to see something and then to go say something. So those cases have to be worked proactively. We actually have to go out and intend to find them. They're not going to show up on someone's desk. That requires bandwidth. That requires officers and agents and labor inspectors and people of goodwill to have space and time in their schedule to do it. And right now, quite frankly, I think labor cases are the added task of the anti-trafficking movement. I think what would make a huge difference is to have a specialized labor trafficking investigative unit, where the only thing that they were supposed to do, or at least the primary thing they were supposed to do, is actually work labor trafficking cases. And now your incentive structure is flipped. The way to get the next promotion, the way to get the next patch on the uniform, is to do labor trafficking cases. And I think if they had room and bandwidth to do it, we could knock it out. I think we could double, even triple our numbers because they're so low. We could double or triple them in a year or two. And it wouldn't even be that expensive of an intervention. If we had a federal labor trafficking investigative unit at HSI, a federal labor trafficking investigative unit at FBI, if we broadened it out and had trafficking sitting in civil rights instead of in child exploitation obscenity, there are all sorts of little moves we could make that wouldn't be that difficult or that expensive, and we could dramatically increase it. Now, when we do that, and I hope we will, we have to be ready to make sure we've got care services and protection services for all those labor trafficking victims that are now survivors. And right now, we don't have that many trafficking shelters where men and boys might be going as victims. We don't have enough beds for individual victims with dependents where they have places to go. There's all sorts of challenges around that. But hopefully we will see more cases. And once we see them, we will have to grow in our ability to provide really smart, thoughtful, individualized care plans to handle that.
Absolutely. And that restaurant case is so important because I think it really brought light to what labor trafficking can look like in this country. It can be restaurants, it can be hotels. Honestly, it can be pretty much anything. Although with the retribution, I'm not sure I would agree with you. I think I would say they should have tripled it, quadrupled it. But definitely a big step in the right direction. John Freeman, can I get your thoughts on this issue?
Sure. It was always the challenge to get the teams that I had connections to from a Washington, D.C. headquarters office to get our teams in the field to look at more, look to build more labor trafficking cases. And again, I'll say it again, I'm a broken record on this. Find a team who can work on this. Don't go at it alone. Don't go independently into working on something. It's not sustainable. You've got to build a resilient, cohesive team, multifaceted. A case that I was made aware of because somebody in my office showed me a newspaper article and said, wow, look at what the team up in Minnesota has done. It was a federal case involving a farm, I think about an hour or so outside of Minneapolis, where workers from the Dominican Republic and maybe one or two other foreign countries were continually coming up every season for planting and harvesting. They were getting paid. They lived in substandard housing. The coercive, they were being nickel and dimed on bills and things. If you needed a ride to town to go to the store, it might be $10. That would then build up debt, and you'll hear a term, debt bondage. So if I'm going to be working on this farm and I think I'm going to be making $500 a month, and I want to send 400 of it back to my family in my old country, but I just had a bill for $600. I'm $100 in the hole. That level of bondage is the troubling factor, and it's a violation of the law, and it got the attention of the federal task force in Minnesota. You don't just run in there and shut down a farm. The illegal employers were sent to prison, federal prison, but new employers took over the farm. I think the government must have come up with a way to sell the farm, but the farm still exists. And many of those workers are still coming back to the United States, hopefully for them after the pandemic clears and they can get their visas and come back to work. But they're now empowered to know that they have always had rights. And they did receive restitution in that case. One other one on a much smaller scale I want to tell you about involved a child who was brought from overseas to be a domestic worker. At the age of 6, she was in an affluent home in Central Texas, helping to be a maid and a nanny at the age of 6, taking care of kids, taking care of a house. It went on for 16 years. I'll say it again, it went on for 16 years. In that time, she never went to school. She never went to a doctor. She never went to a dentist. It's the last trial that I attended, sitting in the gallery, when the victim described how when she had an impacted tooth, she pulled it out with a pair of pliers. She did not go to a dentist. And that shocked the jury. And for some reason, a couple of the defense attorneys thought it was funny, which I think doubly shocked the jury. I am very happy to report that that victim saw a little bit of justice served to her traffickers, a married couple who got 7 years in federal prison. She was employed in their home for 16 years. At some point, maybe our next panel, Rachel, let's bring in a judge too, to talk about how we can help to look at improving sentencing. But it was a question earlier in the chat. What are things that are missing? It kind of goes back to what seems unusual. So with the farm workers in that farm in Minnesota, somebody eventually said to them, you guys aren't being paid enough. You don't have to live like this. And they took that upon them to realize, we need to report this to somebody. The neighbors in that Texas neighborhood who saw this very young girl, sometimes carrying bags of groceries up and down the streets, they always knew something was weird. And occasionally when they would get the courage to ask the family who was where this woman, where this girl worked, they said, oh, she's just one of our cousins. She's visiting from out of town, from out of the country. When you've seen her for 10 years, doesn't something, set off a bell in the back of your head? Eventually, in her sake, it did. And she was able to be helpfully extracted by some of her neighbors because she was able to call them. A horrific story. For me, it was informative for me to be in the courtroom to see that. That's something that I wish more people had a chance to see and not just look at what Hollywood provides in the form of a movie or a 1-hour detective show. That's not reality.
Absolutely. And that is such a tragic story. But thank you for sharing that with us. Jerome, why don't we go to you next on this question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. I think one of the things that people have a hard time comprehending, which we've kind of touched on tonight, is that especially even in labor trafficking, the victims don't really understand that they're victims of labor trafficking. I mean, there was a case actually in the UK that just wrapped up where it was an illegal cannabis farm that was raided. And they asked these individuals, are you being exploited, are you being labor trafficked? And they didn't really get what was going on. And it took these individuals 3 years through the court systems to actually get any justice for themselves. So it's about connecting with these individuals, getting them to understand, what their rights are. We have a really great group here in Florida called the Immokalee Workers Union, and they go out to all the migrant labor camps and they speak with these individuals and let them know what their rights are. And someone's there that they can talk to, in their own language. And they offer help to them. It's important for the individual to know their rights, but also, again, important for us to recognize what's going right in front of us. I mean, there's been cases where people were labor trafficked at Subway, mopping the floors, cleaning up. So again, it's about recognizing what's happening. We had a federal case here where a guy was picking up homeless people, putting them in a barbed wire compound, charging them rent, charging them for their food. And, had 30, 40 people that he was just working to the bone. And finally, someone called it in that something wrong was going on. They were able to just catch this guy and stop this from happening. And again, it's about raising awareness, making sure that people understand their rights, because one of the things, again, with victims of labor or sex trafficking is that, you are just terrified of law enforcement. You're terrified of the legal system. And again, that's why Nate's work is so critical, and everybody else here, because it's about letting victims know that they have rights and they're worthy of having, something good, and they can't be exploited no matter where they're from.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Nate, why don't I go to you next? I know this is an issue that you're really on the front lines of. Can you talk about your experience with forced labor in your line of work?
Sure. And, there's been some great discussion on the topic already. I would just add, by way of supplement, that I totally agree with Ambassador Richmond and the need for an increased level of proactivity as it relates to labor trafficking investigations. I think that sex trafficking cases tend to follow what I might call an investigative template, where that if you follow certain steps, the case is going to trend in a direction of prosecution and either a plea or a conviction, depending on the nature of the circumstances and whether the perpetrator has counsel. What I mean is there are certain defined steps when you get information about a trafficking situation, especially a sex trafficking case, and they tend to follow a model. And if you follow the steps, well, then it's going to lead to the logical conclusion. And many times that's the case, and investigators have figured that out. And so with sex trafficking, a lot of times we're reaching for the low-hanging fruit because the cases are more prolific and we have an established model by which we know we're going to trend in the direction of prosecution. And I think it's also worth pointing out that because human trafficking is so commonly proliferated online, this is not something that's been discussed a lot during this panel, but it's worth pointing out that one of the primary means by which people are recruited into human trafficking today is through the internet. People are leveraging websites. They are leveraging technology, social media platforms. Your cell phone is a very prolific tool by which traffickers are trying to engage with their potential victims. And because that's the case, there's just such a wider market for the sex trafficking to go on. I mean, you think of all the social media apps where they're very visual mediums, and you can see pictures of other people and you can chat with them. And the idea is to meet up and eventually exploit somebody. Well, it's not as common when you're looking for somebody to work on my farm or work in my massage parlor or my hotel. That's just not something that's as common as a site where, for example, sex might be facilitated, and it's well known that that's something that goes on that particular app, for example. So it's worth pointing out the role that the internet has taken on with respect to human trafficking, because it is a primary means by which traffickers attempt to recruit people for exploitation today.
Thank you. Those were all very excellent points. For the last question, I want to ask a question from the chat from an attendee. And the question was about the signs of human trafficking. We talk a lot about if you see something, say something, speak up, but what does that really mean? What are those signs, and what should we be looking out for? Chiquita, as a survivor, I'd like to throw this question to you first. What are some common signs that you see when you work with survivors, and what should people in the audience be keeping an eye out for? I think you're muted.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Sometimes you can, you see young girls, they may be with older men and they don't want to make eye contact. They feel they may seem like they're under control. They can't talk for themselves. That's an indication that something's not right there. You have teenagers that are all of a sudden they're coming into a lot of money. They're dressing, really sexy, and they're talking to older people online. they're going out, that's an indication that something may be going on. You could see children or children that have like physical markings on their bodies, bruises, malnourished. That could be an indication that something is going on as well. Brandings on the bodies. We've seen kids that are branded by some of the traffickers or some of, gangs. And runaways. If you see children on the street, that's an indication that something could be going on as well. So it's a lot of different indicators there. Children online, definitely talking to strangers, talking to even through gaming apps, talking on social media, wanting to meet up with people that are strangers to their parents. You have to be careful with that as well, because that is an indication that something could be going on. They could be getting ready to be lured, by a trafficker. So definitely be mindful of what your children are doing, where they're going, who they're talking to online, even going to a neighbor's home, spending time with their other friends, because we've had a case where a child was going to a parent's home with her kid, and this mother was actually involved in sex trafficking. And so you don't know what's going on at another person's home as well. But it's just different indicators out there. It's not just one thing, but it's a lot.
Definitely. Jayne, would you like to add on to this? Other signs of human trafficking that you know?
Sure. Not a direct answer to your question of signs, but a answer to the question of what people can do. I get calls from people from all over saying, I want to help fight human trafficking? Do I need to travel abroad to do it? And no, as you heard from this conversation, and it happens right here in the United States. But to me, one of the most important things is prevention. And when I've talked to survivors at Covenant House about what could have prevented these experiences, one of the top answers, in addition to a place to stay, is an adult who cared, right? Because remember, like, the pimps are giving them the hug, the birthday cake, spending an interest in their lives. Jerome had mentioned that early. Like, being the adult who cares. Like, in my mind, a good foster parent is the number one, prevention of human trafficking. Being a mentor at a reputable agency is you are preventing human trafficking right there. So when people want to get involved, you do not have to fly across the world. And just being there for a young person in need, being that adult who cares, you are on the front line of human trafficking prevention.
Definitely. There's this misconception that it only happens abroad, it only happens in developing countries, but it's right here in all of our backyards. Jerome?
Just to go off of Jayne's excellent point, one of the things that we found to be tremendously effective is going into schools and talking about healthy relationships, because you'd be amazed how many kids don't understand what healthy love is. So when you go into schools and you talk about healthy relationships, you get so many kids disclosing things that are going on in their homes, that they're being abused, things are happening to them. So it's about giving kids that concept of what love is and how a relationship should be, because in my case especially, I had no clue. I mean, it's taken most of my adult life to sort that out. So when you go into schools and let kids know this is how it should be and this is wrong, then kids can really begin to acknowledge that they need to help, they need to speak out. And so I think we need to implement more of that, and that can circumvent so many situations where kids are taken advantage of. One of the things I want to emphasize about my case and many others, I was trafficked while I was in school. I look like a normal kid. So a lot of situations, these kids aren't really identifiable, but there are definite signs, as Chiquita said. But I think above all else, trust your gut. If you feel like something's not right, make that call. National Human Trafficking Hotline, 24/7, 200 languages. There's no wrong call. I mean, and emphasize, see something, say something. The largest child sex trafficking ring in the United States, run out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, 20 states, including Canada, was broken up by one individual, a police officer who pulled over two young girls in a car, noticed they had fake IDs, which is one of the tools of the trade for human trafficking, called that in and took down this 3 generations of a family running this human trafficking ring that trafficked girls as young as 14. So if you see something, say something, make that call, because you may not save one life, but maybe 5, 10, or even 20, because that's how big these rings can be.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. John Freeman.
Just one thing I would add on top of that, please don't put yourself in harm's way. Please do not feel like you have to be the superhero and fly in with a cape and rescue the person and fly them to safety. There are people who are trained to do this. I'm retired now. If I got a problem, I'm calling Nate. Call the 1-800 number. Rachel's just put it up on the chat box. If you're in another country right now, call your local authorities. Do not endanger yourself. There's every chance that if you were to take direct action, you may cause the trafficker to act in a rash and potentially violent manner. So maybe be a good witness. Be careful, and please don't endanger yourself or those that you think could be being victimized.
Definitely. Nate?
Yeah, I totally echo that. Certainly don't put yourself in harm's way. And along with that, a clarification, that I think is worth making, because I hear it a lot. And people are often worried that, well, I hear what you're saying about see something, say something, but what if I say something and then it's not right and the police turn around and they charge me with a false police report? This is a very common thing that I hear a lot of times. And I just want to clarify that in my work in this field, I've never seen that happen, either at the local level or the federal level or the state level. I've never seen that happen. And I don't think you should be afraid to report something that you see that may or may not be amiss. As John pointed out, it is the job and the responsibility of law enforcement, people like myself and others, to vet out the information that's being provided to determine whether or not there is legitimacy to it. So I just put that out there because I don't want anybody who's in attendance here on this panel to feel like if I make a mistake or it's not right or it doesn't bear out, that I'm somehow going to be in trouble. I have never seen that happen, and I suspect that it would not. Also, I would just add, and keep this in mind, certainly don't put yourself in harm's way, but these cell phones that we have, very powerful tools. They are cameras and they are video recording devices, and we all have them. And so take advantage of that. If you see something that's amiss and you're able to get a photo or a video of an individual or of a young child who may be at risk, or even a license plate would be huge. Those are fantastic resources. Snap that photo, get that video if you can do it safely, and that will help law enforcement quite a bit. So I just offer those things based on my experience of what I hear out there, what people say.
Definitely. Thank you so much for adding that. That's a very important point. And to the audience, I would just say it's always better to be safe than sorry. It's always better to make that wrong call than miss out on actually helping someone who could really need your help. So thank you for that. All right, so this brings us to the end of our panel. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you so much to all of our incredible panelists. You provided so much insight on such a complex topic, and I really appreciate all the perspectives that you shared. Additionally, thank you so much to everyone who attended this panel. I hope you will all walk away from this event with a better understanding of human trafficking. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, guys. God bless you.
Buddy.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
Rachel.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.